Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen. Good afternoon, peasants. If you ask, you shall receive. On the last buy, sell, hold video, there were some people in particular in the comments wanting us to get a little more into the strategy side of things. Now, that's really where I focus on Fridays. If you're new to the channel, make sure you go down and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the future strategy concepts that I talk about, as well as all the other videos that we're doing here every single week on the game of Dynasty. Now, the question that we got, Try Sports Star says, Ayo boys, can we get some draft strategy videos in the near future? I want to dial in for some startups that I got. I'll oblige, because right now, it's really startup season. At this point in time in the summer, all the degenerates, the diehards, the people that are itching, we want football to already start, even though we just got to June. We're going to be doing everything we can to scratch that damn itch. Underdog drafts, dynasty startups, whatever it has to be. So today, let's get into it. Let's talk about the dynasty startups and some strategy. And in particular, wants me to do a two-part series where I'm covering the first part of drafts, let's say picks 1 through 6. And then in part 2, I'll be covering more of the back part of drafts, picks 7 through 12, let's call it. And with this being a two-part series, let's stop dilly-dallying around. Let's get right into this. Quickly, I want to touch on some basic ground rules, some principles, some things that I think are important to note as far as guidelines for dynasty startups. But before we get into all that and drafting from the early part of drafts, you already know what we got to do, man. Let's tuck them. Tuck them damn shirts in. Stop yapping. Let's get into the early part of these drafts. Now let's talk about doing some dynasty startups. And I know for a lot of people don't have a lot of experience or are doing dynasty startups for the first time, it can feel a bit overwhelming because after this year, all we're going to be doing is drafting the incoming rookies every year. So in theory, this is going to be a draft which is going to set up the foundation for your dynasty team. And if you screw this draft up, your entire dynasty team could be screwed in theory. Now, while it's technically true that you could screw up your dynasty startup, it's really not as intimidating as it sounds. A lot of times, once you do this dynasty startup, if you go back and take a look at what your team was, say a year from now or 2 years from now, the large majority of your team, for the most part, could look completely different. You're going to have a lot of opportunities to make trades with your league mates, so your team does not have to completely be dependent on what you do in the startup. Now, while it is important, you want to make sure you don't screw that up. And whether you're relatively new to dynasty startups or not, I want to go over some basic guidelines, some principles. Now, the first thing I think it's really important to start off with, let's understand the scoring and the format of your league that you're getting ready to draft. How many teams are in the league? Is it 10, 12, or 14? The amount of teams that are in the league can drastically change. Things like scarcity. If we're in a 10-team league, which is super flex, every single week there's only going to be 20 quarterbacks that are going to be starting week in and week out. You get to 12, that's 24. You get to 14, we're at 28. And the higher you go up with more teams in your league, if you're in a super flex format, for example, the scarcity of the quarterback position goes up with it. If you're in a one quarterback league, the scarcity for quarterback doesn't really exist at all. And where they're going to be going and valued accordingly in that league is drastically different than it is in super flex. So it's really important, I think, to have an understanding of the format and the scoring. Is it half PPR? Is it full PPR? Is it tiered PPR? Some of these formats where the running back gets a half point per catch, wide receiver gets 1, and then the tight end position gets 1.5. With tight end premium, how heavy is the tight end premium? So essentially, what's the format? How many teams are in this league? What is the format of this league? Basically, how many roster spots am I going to be starting on a weekly basis, and at what positions, and how many of each position? And then ultimately, how is each position scoring in this format? I think it's important to at least think about the format before we start trying to figure out what our strategy is. If we don't know the format and what the scoring is and how many players we're going to be needing at each position, it's going to be really hard to have a very good strategy, and a lot of times those strategies can go awry. At this point for me, when I go into any new startup, because I'm in so many with so many different scoring formats, I use the WoRP tool. The WoRP tool takes into account your specific league, and it shows you what positions are the most valuable relative to the average player at that position in your league. Now, you don't necessarily have to go as far as getting the WoRP tool to have a basic understanding of this in your league, but at least go ahead and take a look in Sleeper at the league format, how many teams are in the league, and the scoring overall for each position. And now with that basic understanding, you can have somewhat of a plan when you go into the startup at what you want the core of your team to look like. While it's important to have an understanding of what you want your team to look like, it's even more important to be flexible and make sure you're able to adapt to what's going on around you. That is even more important to making sure you come out of this startup with the best team you can. Which leads us into the next thing. Be extremely careful if you're going to try and send away your future first round picks while in the startup. It's pretty rare that a team actually wins a title during the startup draft. But it is very possible for you to have such a poor startup draft that you are out of the mix entirely. And if you also trade away your future first round picks while losing the startup draft, you can basically put yourself in one of the worst positions that you could possibly be in Dynasty. Now, one of the points earlier was being flexible relative to what's happening around you in the startup draft. But this point here is being flexible in the early parts of the startup in a different sense, is the idea of not attaching myself to aging veterans too early in the draft to where now I feel hamstrung to only draft older players. I don't have a problem drafting aging veterans at a certain point in the startup, but in the early parts of the startup draft, I don't want to be drafting aging veterans, the first 2 rounds especially. The last place you want to be in Dynasty is having a group of older players which are not producing enough points to actually win you a title. The next point here is having an understanding of how I value players, in particular in how I tier them. One of the things I don't want to do in a startup, I don't want to be drafting the start of a new tier if there's a run on the position. Basically in this scenario, I would be continuing this positional run, but I'm going to be getting the short end of the stick because I'm getting the far lower tiered player at that position, and that's only going to be playing into the hand of everyone else in the startup who took the same position but got a much higher valued player. And the last basic point here, you don't want to be going in and out of each round drafting to fill out your roster, which you don't even have to set your lineup until September. Basically, you want to draft the best player available, and after the startup's over, then you can go out and make trades or go to the waiver wire if you need to try to fill out your starting roster in week 1. All right, so now that we got those basic principles and concepts out of the way and my power finally came back on, let's get into it. Let's talk about addressing your Dynasty startup from the early part of the draft. Now, for the sake of context and consistency, we're going to be addressing this like it's a 12-team league, starting 10 players, Superflex, where it's full PPR with a half-point tight end premium. So if you're in a 12-team Superflex league and you're getting ready to do your Dynasty startup, and let's say it's a start 9 or a start 11, even a start 12, a lot of the same principles will be applying to that league, as long as it isn't crazy different when it comes to the scoring settings. But if you're in a 1 quarterback, for instance, the Superflex in a 12-team league is going to be wildly different context here than what you're looking at in a 1 quarterback league. Now, even if you're going to be getting into a Dynasty startup where it's a 10-team league or a 14-team league with Superflex settings similar to this, you can definitely take a look at some of this. Just understand that it's not always going to be a seamless transition when we're talking about a 10-team league versus this 12-team league versus a 14-team league. In a 10-team league, the ADP is very different when we're looking at a lot of the receivers are going earlier into the first round, and also the running back position is getting up higher into the startups because the quarterback scarcity doesn't exist. So in a 10-team league, you obviously want to draft your Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, the elite quarterbacks that everybody still feels like is a hammer at the quarterback position. But as you start to get further down the quarterback rankings, those quarterbacks are going to fall relative to the skill players in a 10-team league because the scarcity isn't there, and they're not going to be offering nearly as much relative to the replacements in that type of a league. In a 12-team league, obviously the scarcity comes up and the quarterbacks go up the board. Basically, if you take a look at the ADP in a 14-team league, because you're adding another 2 teams in that 14-team league, you're spreading the players thinner across all the rosters, and the quarterback scarcity really pushes up the quarterbacks in value in a 14-team league relative to this 12-team league. So those are some things to keep in mind if you are going into a 10-team or a 14-team league. Not saying you can't use a lot of the same principles, but understanding it's not a one-size-fits-all. Now, with that being said, if you have an early pick in the startup, so you're talking picks 1 through 6, picks 1 through 4, there's really no debate for me. This is where you need to lock down and secure the elite quarterback in this format. If you take a look at the rankings that I have on the BDGE website, for me, it's pretty straightforward. I have Patrick Mahomes at 1, Josh Allen at 2, Jalen Hurts at 3, Lamar Jackson at 4, and then I have CJ Stroud at 5. But I do think once we get to pick 5, depending on how you feel and want to build your team, you could make your case if you believe really strongly in Justin Jefferson or CeeDee Lamb, whoever your wide receiver 1 is, drafting him there. I certainly understand it. And when I think about what's going to come back to me in the second round and what's going to be available at quarterback, what I want to do is actually go through 4 different Dynasty startups, 12-team Superflex leagues here, where you can see what took place in every different one of these drafts. When you go into a new startup, you may think you have an indicator if you know the people you're playing with, what's likely to happen in a startup. But I've been in so many different startups where you think you have an idea of what's going to happen, and the reality is chaos ensues, and the draft could be wildly different than what you maybe had expected by round 3 even. So when we go through all 4 of these different drafts, this is exactly why I think I need to just lock down the quarterback at the 5 or 6 spot. So looking at one of the first 4 drafts here, this one is Army Dynasty, and in this 12-team league, you see here at the 106 actually, Justin Jefferson gets taken there. Then 107 CD, 108 Amon-Ra. Jamar Chase actually goes after Marvin Harrison Jr. Again, you never know what's going to happen in a draft. And if you see that Joe Burrow now goes at the 112, the edge that I really believe is in those first 6 picks here, when we have this from a strategy standpoint, was given and ceded to the person at the 112, and now they got to double tap and get Joe Burrow and Caleb Williams. Now Caleb Williams, who realistically at that 112 you're likely to be drafting as your quarterback 1, you get to double tap on the way back and get Caleb Williams as your quarterback 2. This is an unbelievable foundation. Allen gets to secure a very safe and high upside quarterback in 6-point per passing touchdown like Joe Burrow, as well as the upside of Caleb Williams going to this great situation. Now, drafting at the 112 and the 201 there, that's really going to be talked about next video. We're talking about drafting from the caboose, the 7 through 12 spot. But think about it now when it comes back to you. So at this point, now Burrow comes off, Caleb Williams, Justin Herbert, Jordan Love, and then Dak Prescott actually goes well ahead of his typical ADP of the 3rd round at the 206 in this draft. So now at that 106 spot, you take Justin Jefferson, and you don't necessarily feel the greatest about the quarterback. For me, Kyler Murray was still a quarterback on the board where you could have ended up threading the needle there, but passed on that for Bijan Robinson. I certainly understand the upside of Bijan Robinson, really tantalizing. You could be looking at the wide receiver 1 and the running back 1, but now the problem for me is you now have at quarterback 1 Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence has shown us a pretty reasonable safe floor. Back end quarterback 1, high end quarterback 2. Maybe this year we actually see him take a little bit of a step forward, but realistically, what is that going to be looking like? Obviously, the idea here is you're going to get a hammer wide receiver and a hammer running back, so you don't need to have an elite quarterback. But Trevor Lawrence in the 3rd round is my quarterback 1. Let's not even go through the fact of Kyron Williams and Kyle Pitts. But when you take T-Law as your first quarterback and your quarterback 1 in round 3, and then even when it comes back to you in round 4, in most scenarios, you're maybe going to get a chance to get a Jared Goff. Could be like this, where Jaden Daniels goes ahead of T-Law for you. Then you go T-Law. Then there's a run of quarterbacks. Purdy, Goff, Tua. Drake May comes off in the 3rd round there. And then by the time it gets back to you at 407, then there's McCarthy, Mayfield, Nix, Levis, a lot of upside plays, and you certainly don't feel great reaching on guys like Baker Mayfield or Bryce Young in the 4th round. So at this point now, I basically have a team where I have a safe quarterback 1, hopefully, in Trevor Lawrence, and then in each individual draft, how far the quarterbacks fall and when I feel comfortable taking my quarterback 2, and ultimately what that player realistically is going to give me as a floor. I don't really like doing that, especially in a 12 team where we're starting 10 players and this is a 6-point per passing touchdown. Even in a 4-point per passing touchdown, we're only starting 10, and 2 of which are going to be quarterbacks, which still are the highest scoring position in the game. And ultimately the point here is when I had the opportunity to take Joe Burrow at the 106, I don't love the switch outcome here where I get Trevor Lawrence, and then at this point you draft Bryce Young a round ahead of ADP in the 6th. I just don't love it at all. Now, if we go back in time and just kind of reverse this, if Joe Burrow is your pick at the 106, obviously each pick's like a domino. This entire board could fall slightly different. But here's the thing, even with that being said, I think it's really realistic and fair to say that there's a very good chance at that 207 spot. You could draft an AJ Brown at that 207 spot more than likely. A guy like Puka Nacua is still likely to be there for you. Malik Neighbors, if that's your cup of tea, you want to go young and you believe in the prospect profile of Malik Neighbors. Basically with sequencing, I'd much rather have Joe Burrow and a really great receiver in AJ Brown or Puka Nacua, and obviously the upside of Malik Neighbors. While they are not Justin Jefferson, I'd much rather have that than Justin Jefferson and Trevor Lawrence. So basically from a strategy standpoint in this type of a format, that's the way I'm going to play it. Now, if you like this type of range of outcome and this is the type of team you'd want to build, certainly consider this at the 105 or the 106 spot. But I think regardless, in this type of a format, there's no way that I can argue not taking the quarterbacks, especially at 1 through 4. And basically what's likely to fall to me in round 2 at QB, I can't really do it. Take a look at some of these other drafts. Gotham City here. The first 5 picks, they're slightly different order, but basically the same thing. You now take Joe Burrow here instead of Justin Jefferson. The quarterback run continues. On the way back, you actually get a chance now to draft A.J. Brown and Puka Nacua, or do what this person here did and double down and get Kyler Murray. So I just think you're a lot more flexible. If you take a Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, C.J. Stroud, whoever's there at that 106 spot, if you take that and lock that quarterback in, you don't have to really worry about what's coming back to you in the 2nd round. And if there's a run on some of these high-end quarterbacks, now all of a sudden, while you do have Justin Jefferson, you may be looking at your quarterback room in Superflex like, what did I do? Take a look at this other one here. This is Andrew's league. So this is the Hollywood Huddle. The 105 is actually Justin Jefferson. So we can kind of look at a similar situation at this team here. Justin Jefferson goes at the 105. 106, Kyler Murray. Then you got Burrow, 107. Andrew takes Caleb at the 108. Then the other 3 receivers come off the board, CD, Chase, and Marvin Harrison. Then Lamar and A-Rich come off. But then you see Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then you see another little run of the quarterbacks here, where it's Jordan Love, Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, and now rookie in the vet takes Breece Hall at the 208. And basically it's a very similar scenario as the other time when Justin Jefferson went at that 106 spot. Now you end up taking the running back in round 2, and you certainly could be looking at a situation where you have the best wide receiver in the game and the best running back in the game, whether it's Breece Hall or Bijan Robinson. For me, though, in sequencing, this is not the way that I'd like to optimally team build. Now, the other thing to keep in mind in these 12-team Superflex leagues, it seems to be pretty universal that the third round reversal is what's implemented. And it makes so much sense. If you get one of these early picks in picks 1 through 6, you basically get so much security and upside at the quarterback position that we feel like is going to be around for a long time. It's a very optimal position to be in. So they're basically trying to even out the fact that the people in the back half of the draft don't get that same type of safety net and upside. So the third round reversal is trying to put more value to them. And when you think about it from that lens, now if there is no third round reversal like Army Dynasty, right? Patrick Mahomes at the 101. Now you get Christian McCaffrey at the 212 and Kyler Murray at the 301. It's just a cheat code. So I feel like the optimal setting is to make sure that it is third round reversal. But if you're drafting in this very early range, again, it doesn't really matter. You just get rewarded with a much better player in the third round. I'm still just taking the quarterback. And that's another thing to keep in mind with the third round reversal. If you're drafting in the earlier part, the earlier you're drafting, the closer to the 101, you're basically going to have a really long wait until it comes back to you in round 2 and then again in round 3. And because you go ahead and lock down that elite quarterback, you're going to have a good handle of tiers and players that are going to be here. And you're basically going to have to be a lot more comfortable with the guys that are going to be falling to you typically in this range and just taking the best available, unless you want to go ahead and try to trade up. We're not going to be discussing a whole lot as far as trade ups go, just for the sake of keeping this video digestible and just drafting at the spot that you're in. The one exception I'll make in this format, basically if I'm able to secure my quarterback 2 as a guy like Lamar or A. Rich, Joe Burrow, Caleb Williams, someone that's falling down the board, and if you're able to make the trade up to secure that, whether it is coming off of a second and a third round pick, or you have to come off of your future first, if I'm able to lock down what I believe 2 of the elite quarterbacks are in this format, that's going to be probably the exception to the rule as far as trade ups. But with what comes back to you in round 2, if you have this earlier pick in round 1, so let's say I got a guy like Mahomes, Allen, Jackson, Hurts, Stroud, whatever the case may be, Burrow, and on my way back, there's a guy like Kyler Murray there, Jordan Love, or if you wanted to go ahead at this point, knowing it's not going to come back to you toward the later part of the third, I would possibly make an exception for Dak and go ahead and stack those quarterbacks. So if that type of a situation falls, I feel like that's really optimal. Now, if there's a really heavy run on quarterbacks and none of those guys make it to me, at that point, there's an extremely high likelihood because of the running backs that are highly likely to come off the board, guys like Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, Jahmyr Gibbs, and arguably Christian McCaffrey in that mix here. Because those 4 running backs have a chance to come off with those type of quarterback runs, at this point, I'm really likely in the back end of the second round to get one of A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, or Malik Neighbors. Now, I get it if you think that taking Malik Neighbors in the back part of round 2 is a little rich. I think one of those 3 receivers is really likely to make it to you there. And when you're looking across these 4 drafts, A.J. Brown comes off the board at the 208, the 209, the 208, and the 301. Puka Nacua, basically the same situation, 210, 208. Now, if none of those guys make it to you and there's a heavy run on quarterbacks, now at that point, you're probably going to be looking at the production upside of Tyreek Hill, trying to capture that for 1 or 2 more seasons, even though he's getting older, or at this spot, going ahead and swinging for one of these elite running backs. Now, if I had it my way, getting a guy like Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, or Dak Prescott, and the reason I say that, if you throw out this draft of Army Dynasty, where it is not third round reversal, basically what's pretty consistent across a lot of the startups that I've seen at this point is when you get to the later part of the third and third round reversal, the quarterback room is really dried up. Gotham City. Brock Purdy comes off at the 303, and basically the only quarterbacks left when it gets to you at the late part of the third round is Tua Tagovailoa and Jared Goff that you might consider. I think taking those guys in the late part of the third would be definitely a reach. You take a look at this other draft, which is going on in the 6th round at this point. Again, in the third round, Brock Purdy comes off at the 307. You might have had a chance to get him if you had the 106 pick, but Jared Goff actually went off the board at the 302 in this draft, so you could take, again, a guy like Tua Tagovailoa at the late part of the third round. Again, I think you're probably reaching if you take Tua at that point. And taking a look at the Hollywood Huddle, the draft that Andrew was in the 4th round, you got Bryce Young and Deshaun Watson coming off. I mean, you talk about reach, it's absolutely insane. And just when I think about it again from sequencing, CJ Stroud going at the 103. Back at the 210, you take Puka Nacua. Again, not a horrible choice, but if you think about it from the standpoint of those quarterbacks that are coming off the board in the 2nd round there, at that point, you could have taken Jane Daniels if you wanted to take the upside play, or you could have taken Dak Prescott, who comes off the board at the 306. And just sequencing, right? If you were to say that Dak Prescott is your pick there at the 210, so you now have CJ Stroud and Dak Prescott, and you get Rome Odunze at the 310, and then at the 403, instead of taking Bryce Young, you get Michael Pittman. I would much rather have CJ Stroud, Dak Prescott, Rome Odunze, and Michael Pittman than I would CJ Stroud, Puka Nacua, Rome Odunze, and Bryce Young. Basically, at this point, wanting to have Puka Nacua and get what you believe is a high-end wide receiver output, certainly understand that. But doing that and drafting Puka Nacua basically cost you feeling secure at that quarterback 2 spot, and for a lot of people causes them to reach at this point. Overall takeaway there, if there is a really big quarterback run that comes off the board in the startup before it gets to you in the late part of the second round and you have to draft a wide receiver, or if you decide to forego drafting a guy like Dak Prescott or Kyler Murray, if you do go that route, don't reach in the third or fourth. And the reason I'm stressing that, do not reach for this quarterback 15, 16, 17, because now you finally have a chance to pick at the turn depending on how early you are in the draft. This is where it gets exciting for me. So if you have at this point secured the elite quarterback in the first 6 picks, then you ended up getting a guy like Kyler, Dak, Jordan Love. At this part of the third, and in so many of these different drafts, you're able to secure maybe not the elite Justin Jefferson, maybe not even quite Puka Nacua, but I could strongly make the case that some of these guys do have really high ranges of outcomes, and you're going to get a chance to get 2 of them back to back on this turn. Starting with the Gotham City one, this is literally the dream scenario if you have that 106 pick. You get Joe Burrow at 106, then on the way back you get Kyler Murray at the 207. You still get Malik Neighbors at the 307, and then when it comes back to you, because of all the stuff going on with him not having a contract, somehow Brandon Ayuk falls into your lap at the 406. You've started off really great here. Now, giving you both examples where you do secure the quarterback or you go ahead and decide to forgo that. So if you look at the 101 and the 102, you have both cases here where Biscuit takes Lamar at the 102 and then takes Tyreek Hill at the 211. Passes on those quarterback options. Then at the 311, you get Michael Pittman. And then at the 402, Saquon Barkley. I don't really love this pick. I definitely see the upside, but he is getting older and we have seen injuries. I don't love doing that at the 402 when I could have taken a guy like Rome Odunze or Brandon Ayuk. And now K6, the opposite end of the spectrum where you get Patrick Mahomes, you go ahead and take T-Law as your quarterback too, if that's your cup of tea and you still believe in the talent. Then you get Devontae Smith at the 312. I definitely would not have taken James Cook at the 401 here. But the point is, these are both pictures. Could have had 2 top 15, 20 type receivers paired with Patrick Mahomes and T-Law, or you could have had a great start with Lamar Jackson as your quarterback 1, and then had Tyreek Hill, Michael Pittman, and another young, exciting receiver in Rome Odunze or Brandon Ayuk. What is coming back to you in the 5th round? There's so much variance between how people are going to value things that you could be looking at a lot of different scenarios. If everything broke right, I would love to continue to wait on the tight end position and not have to take one here in the 5th round. But if there was a lot of wide receiver runs and quarterback runs at this point, and I'm looking at guys like Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, and even Brock Bowers in this range, these would be tight ends that I would be comfortable with drafting in the mid to the late part of the 5th round. But that would basically only be the case for me if all these guys in particular were gone. Nico Collins, Zay Flowers, DK Metcalf, DJ Moore. If I get past that part of the tier at the receivers, I feel like now I'm starting to draft the next group of receivers, which realistically I could get that same type of receiver in the early part or mid part of the 6th round. This is when I would probably be willing to pivot to the tight end position or taking a guy like Devon Achane if he makes it to me at this part of the 5th round because of the weekly upside that he carries with that speed in the Miami offense. Those would be some caveats if I wasn't able to continue this wide receiver run that I would like to do. Basically, there's going to be so many of those receivers that I'm comfortable with continuing to keep the receiver run going if a lot of these receivers came off the board that I really like in the 4th and 5th round before it came to my turn. And then in the 6th round, those group of receivers are going to be guys like T. Higgins, George Pickens, Jordan Addison, JSN, Xavier Worthy even, that I would be comfortable drafting in the 6th round. So in this 5th and 6th round part of the turn, I'd be willing to deviate from the receiver run for certain guys, basically certain tight ends or running backs if they were to fall. And at this point, if I haven't gotten my quarterback too, this probably is not the spot where I want to be drafting a quarterback. This is not likely to be a quarterback value. Probably still going to be reaching. If somehow in the 5th round a guy like Jared Goff was there or Tua Tagovailoa, but at this point, for the most part, I'm kind of just okay admitting that I don't have a strong super flex spot and continuing to build up the core of my team. None of the guys that I've talked about drafting outside of Tyreek Hill are really getting close to that age apex at this point. Now, when we get to the 7th round, this is where it gets interesting. You could continue drafting youth and upside. Guys like Ladd McConkey, Brian Thomas Jr., Keon Coleman. And while all of those guys are nice and they do offer some upside, the truth is their prospect profile being drafted this late in the 1st round, although nobody wants to hear it, they're not necessarily the safest of investments. They certainly carry some upside and they could be huge payoffs, but there's a more than realistic chance that they don't give you much in production, and they may be a little harder to trade when we get into the mid to later part of the season because they're not producing in an elite clip for teams. But at this point in the 7th round, depending on how I'm feeling about my team, if I really like the start and the core of it, if I think I'm going to be in a position to have a chance to compete, now I'm starting to look at guys closer to the age apex, and that's why they're pushed down at the 7th round and further. And now at this point, I'm far more willing to look at a lot of these older receivers and take my shot for the next 1 or 2 years. Guys like Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, Amari Cooper, as well as a few other receivers in this range that have high-end range of outcomes at the receiver position, but they're just getting older, as well as guys like Derrick Henry at the running back position that could give you elite production, even if it's only for a year or two. At this point, I'm really starting to pivot to basically taking best player available regardless of age and positions. I want to make sure I do have my super flex spot secured. Now, as my pick is getting ready to come up into the mid part or late part of the 7th round, if I haven't drafted my quarterback too, I feel like one of the biggest things that people can often miss is really reading the room. I'm keeping a ton of tabs on my league mates and what they have at the quarterback room. How many of the quarterbacks do you feel comfortable with left on the board, as well as how many teams might continue to pass on quarterbacks, or is everybody getting ready to draft a quarterback and you better do so now? In the 7th round, if it's getting really low as far as quarterbacks that you're comfortable with in your queue, you're looking at guys like Baker Mayfield, Kirk Cousins, Matt Stafford, and then you get to really gross territory at quarterback. If there's not very many of these guys left in my queue in the 7th round and I don't have a pick really early in the 8th round, and at that point on the swing before it comes back to my spot, if I can look and say there's 2 or 3 teams drafting before I'm up again in the 8th round and they both have 2 quarterbacks, at that point, maybe I'll be willing to wait and not draft them in the 7th round. But if we're getting really low in the queue and I'm looking, and they absolutely could be looking at taking their second quarterback, this is where I'm likely to go ahead and press the button on the 7th round. I'm also willing to start taking some shots on some tight ends in the 8th round. Guys like David Njoku, Evan Ingram, George Kittle if somehow he makes it there. And then at this point, I'm looking to build up my running back room. I'm looking at guys like Trey Benson, Najee Harris, Aaron Jones, Zamir White, Joe Mixon, Blake Corum, Marshawn Lloyd, Ramondre Stevenson, Brian Robinson, Tajay Spears, Jalen Wright, Jalen Warren. I'll even start shooting shots on guys that are really old and people assume at this point are going to fall off. Guys like Alvin Kamara, James Conner. There's just so many guys in that 8th to 12th round range at the running back position that I'm willing to draft. Now that wraps up at least the first 10 rounds. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of this video. If you have any follow-up questions or things you wanted me to get into a little more, I'll try to get to some of these comments and give you some follow-up if there was anything that you wanted me to address in a more detailed manner. That's the first part of a 2-part series here, drafting from the earlier spots, picks 1 through 6 in a Dynasty startup this summer. I'll see you back here, same time, same place next week, talking drafting from the caboose. I'm out of here. Peace.